The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
We are living in an attention economy, and so there are actually, strategies that are striving to take our attention and to keep our attention. So we actually have to fight against it more in this technological age than before. But what we attend to very much forms the basis of the way we build or atrophy our imagination. I mean, we're surrounded by things every day, and we could be paying attention to the flowers and the scents and the smells and the small things that are so beautiful, or we could just be paying attention to our phones. I'm guilty. And so we have some choice, not only with what we're inundated with, but where we train our attention.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Karen Swallow Prior is one of the leading evangelical writers and commentators of our time. Her new book is The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. In this episode, Dr. Prior and I talk about the role of imagination in the making of meaning. And we talk about what happens when we start to examine the unexamined metaphors that make it possible for us to make sense of the world, while also limiting our possibilities for making sense of the world. Karen Swallow Prior, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. I'm so excited about your new book, The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on with you again.
Yeah. I guess maybe we'll just start. How do you, when people ask you what this book is about, what do you tell them?
Well, the shortest description I can give is it's more Charles Taylor than it is C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. Because of the word imagination, that's where people's minds immediately go. But I also recognize that a lot of my readers, that in my target audience, maybe they've heard of Charles Taylor, but they haven't read him, they aren't familiar with him. So I am a teacher, so I do take time to just sort of unpack and explain, at a lay level, who Charles Taylor is and why I think his thinking is important, and what the connection is between this very theoretical, philosophical idea of the imaginary and imagination as we understand it. And then from there, how I see it having affected the evangelical movement for 300 years. Okay.
Well, maybe we'll just start with what is the social imaginary? I mean, that's such an important idea for Charles Taylor, but it's not self-evident, right? It's not something that we all know what that means. So maybe let's start there. So we've got a social imaginary, and then we've got an imagination, which is more of an individual thing. So this
Exactly.
conversation it's we're all set up now. So you start with social imaginary, then you go to the imagination.
Well, actually, I like to start with one thing before the imaginary. And this came out of a talk I gave recently where someone asked me this, and I realized, oh, I wish I had put this in the book. That always happens. But, with my background and maybe a lot of your listeners, we have a pretty good understanding of what biblical worldview is, or just worldview in general. And that's a lot of my background. I'm a big worldview person. I love, thinking about worldview, teaching worldview. But worldview is very... it's very conscious, it's very rational, it's very articulated and deliberate. And it's the way we use our minds consciously to think about things. The social imaginary is what's sort of underneath the surface. So like if the biblical worldview might be the tip of the iceberg that we see, and the social imaginary, as Taylor describes it, is a precognitive sort of under the surface pool of images, stories, legends, myth, and narratives that drive our desires, our vision of the good life, the way we think things are supposed to go. And we don't necessarily think about those ideas and images and stories and beliefs and patterns until we stop and kind of try to examine them and see that they're underneath. And that's what I do in this book. And the other important thing is that there's no one social imaginary. There are many of them, and we are affected by many of them. So if we were doing a Venn diagram, it would look very messy. But it really, the big difference is that these are just sort of the myths and legends and ideas that are underneath the surface that we just carry around with us and take for granted until we start to examine them.
I guess it was James K. Smith says that much of our, you quote, I'm getting this from you actually, much of our action is acting out a kind of script that has unconsciously captured our imaginations. And I guess that's a nice summary of what a social imaginary is. It's this idea, as you said, a definition of the good life, perhaps, that that we can easily think of as just some sort of bedrock truth, but in fact it is a constructed. Is that a fair way to?
Exactly. That is a very fair way. And a really maybe easy example to think about this is, and I talk about it in the book, but not quite in this context, but is that the idea of the American dream. We all, if we live in America, we have this idea, lots of others that go along with it, like freedom, justice, the American way, all of those things. But just take the American dream. We might not use that phrase. We might not be thinking about it consciously, but we have this idea that if we haven't met a certain standard, like bought a house by a certain age, or don't have the picket fence or around the house, that we've perhaps failed in some way. And or if we do have that, we've achieved something in some way. And again, we don't even have to be consciously thinking about it to realize that this is a narrative or an expectation that we've inherited, and it may be good, it may be suitable, it may not be, but it's just there in the air that we breathe, and breathe so much expectation and hopes and desires that, again, they may be good, they may be bad, but we have to at least stop and examine them and say, is this what it means to be successful, or is this what I need for my happiness? So that's a good example.
As you say in your book, or it at the very least suggests, but I think you're pretty clear about it. We think of our wants as coming from inside us, and we don't really know the extent to which they come from outside us. And it's helpful to I mean, I love boiled peanuts. That seems like the most natural thing in the world to me. But if I hadn't grown up in Georgia, I probably wouldn't love boiled peanuts. And
right.
When I went off to college was when I found out that not everybody in the world likes boiled peanuts. It's just kind of a thing that I got a taste for because of where I lived. It wasn't innate, although it's still hard for me to believe that that's not just an innate thing that that comes from inside.
I mean, imagine the people who love race cars, right? I mean, they're a very small minority of the human beings who've lived on this earth, because race cars have not been around for as long as human beings have, right? I mean, so much has to do with when and where we're born and our culture and community. So.
Yeah. If a person who loves race cars had grown up in Roman times, I guess they would have loved chariot racing? Is that kind of how that works?
But horses are a whole different thing from ours.
Yeah.
I am, I do love horses. And I don't even know that they're parallel, but maybe the racing part, but still it involves so many other things.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the social imaginary is it's a sort of shared imagination that we don't typically don't think too much about one way or another. It's like the goldfish story. The one goldfish says to the other, "How's the water?" and the other one says, "What's water?" Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and then make the connection if you maybe say another sentence or two about how that shared imaginary relates to individual imagination.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is how we tend to think about imagination when we do think about it as more an individual thing. Like, we all know we have an imagination. We sometimes think about ourselves as having a good one or a bad one or a weak one or a strong one, when in fact we're using our individual imaginations all the time, whether we realize it or not. And so we form an imagination for ourselves out of many sources, but one of them is this sort of collective pool that I talked about before. And we just may not realize that, again, we were talking about desires and appetites. We might not realize that those things that we imagine as being fulfilling or leading us to the good life may be drawn from something much larger than our own individual imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, at one point you draw a distinction between imagination as mirror and imagination as lamp. And one way I think about the imagination is somehow I am reflecting reality. And actually, help me out here. I'm not doing it. I may not be be qualified to explain the difference.
Yeah, that's sort of an ancient set of metaphors that have been used to talk about the imagination. Is that the imagination can be something that we think of as reflecting back on reality, like a mirror, or something that sheds light on reality. And it's really both things.
Sure.
Another way of thinking about it is, the old expression we might say, does art imitates life? And then we say life imitates art. There's sort of an interplay between those things. It's not just that we imagine something out of nothing. We imagine based on the things that we have experienced. I mean, they might be something creative that doesn't exist in reality, but it's still drawn from materials from our own experience in the world around us. And so that there's an interplay that I think that metaphor of the mirror and the lamp.
Yeah. Well, you point out that that our imagination is shaped by the things that we see in the world around us, and yet what we see in the world around us is shaped by our imagination, and it is somehow the things we see. It's not just the world's a very big place, and there's more to see than I can see, and so again, I'm gonna need your help here. The as you said, imagination shapes what we see shapes our imagination, but also there's some limitations there. Right. I mean, can you rescue me here, Karen?
I'll help you out. Yes, I can. I certainly can. So two things going on here, I think. I mean, one is you're talking about this part of what I write is, and I say this in the book, is just the fact that we can do this imagination. We can we can imagine things that we haven't seen or that we read about or that someone tells us about. This is what it means to be human and made in the image of God, who, we are made in his image. And this creative ability, this imaginative ability that we have is a reflection of his nature. I mean, I love my dogs. I spend a lot of time with dogs. I think they're really intelligent and fun and cool, but they aren't sitting around imagining things that I talk to them about.
Yeah.
Yes, I do talk to my dogs. So there's that element where we have this creative ability. But then, as you mentioned, we have the limitation as well. And the quote that I use to kind of illustrate that, which is a famous one, and but it's so good, as much of Lewis is so good. But it's that passage where he talks about the child offered a holiday at the sea, and he doesn't know what that is. He's content with making mud pies in the slum because he doesn't even know what a holiday at the sea is. And so in many ways that's the human condition, right? We cannot imagine beyond our own experience or the apparatus that gives us that experience. So it's both our imaginations are both creative and limited in that way.
Yeah. Well, it's also troubling to think that we exercise choice in what inputs come into us, right? What information we gather. And the truth is, and you mentioned there's not one social imaginary, there are many social imaginaries, and our social imaginaries can get increasingly polarized, and that Venn diagram can start to spread apart as we, some of us choose to get our information and our inputs from one place, and others, and we act as if there's no shared reality in which we all participate in or shaped by. That's a little alarming.
It is, and this is where and why I give some attention. I did not mean to make that pun, but I give attention to attention, right? Because we are inundated with information and experiences and sensory experience, all kinds of things. And a lot of that we don't have much of a choice about. We have some choice, but where we train our attention is where we do have some choice. And we are living in an attention economy. And so there are actually, strategies and formulas and technologies that are striving to take our attention and to keep our attention. So we actually have to fight against it more in this technological age than before. But what we attend to very much forms the basis of the way we build or atrophy our imagination. I mean, we're surrounded by things every day, and we could be paying attention to the flowers and the scents and the smells and the small things that are so beautiful, or we could just be paying attention to our phones. I'm guilty. And so we have some choice, not only with what we're inundated with, but where we train our attention.
Yeah. It is odd how easy it is for our attention to be move away from the local into the what's not directly related to us. As you said, I've got so much going on in my yard right now. Plants growing and squirrels,
weeds overtaking,
dogs and weeds, all that kind of stuff. And for some reason that doesn't get as much of my attention as it could.
And I do want to give a shout out based on what the point you just made, to one of my favorite books and most formative, influential things I read early in my adulthood and that's Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, because when he talks about the shift from print culture to what he calls showbiz culture or television culture, even before the digital age, one of the points he makes is that the telegraph and the telegram and television were all giving us information from across the world that we couldn't do anything about. Right. And so that changed everything. And that's, of course, just multiplied with the digital age. So that point about just, our attention being drawn to things that have nothing to do with what's happening right around us physically or locally, that problem has been around for a while, but it's even worse now.
Yeah. Is it Postman who points out before the telegraph, nobody could get information faster than a horse could run?
I don't remember that line, but that sounds like him. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, since you mentioned Postman, I did have one question from your book when you mentioned Postman, and he talks about the idea that that print culture creates a linear sense of time and story, and and I guess Postman lamented that visual media were not as linear. Am I doing an okay job of summarizing that?
Yeah, you are. You are.
And what I didn't understand is that's assuming that linearity is more valuable than non-linearity, right? I mean,
yeah, right. No, he definitely has a bias toward the word versus the image, and linearity and rationality versus, the sort of evocativeness of images and even words that are not so linear. So that's personally why I love Postman, because I really like what he says. But he's also, he admits, he's writing basically a Jeremiah or a polemical. So he is spurring us to kind of to question the limits of his argument, and that may mean, kind of going the other way and saying, okay, what about images? What about visual art?
Right.
Because
I mean, the reason I ask is I feel like it's an example of a point you make, is that we to value, for instance, linear rational thinking over other things, is that's part of an imaginary too, and and sometimes it's easy to come to that and go, well, obviously linear rational thinking is better than whatever the alternative is, except that, I mean, we might say obviously the scientific world is more real than the theological world, like that. You can say obviously in front of any of these social imaginaries and sound like you know what you're talking about, when what you're really doing is not really thinking through some of the larger issues.
Yeah, I mean, when you say obviously, you're admitting that you're not aware of the underlying assumptions, right? Because it may not be obvious. And this is the gift of, what some would call and some wouldn't call, but I'll call postmodernity, right? If modernity is the elevation of reason and rationality to the expense of the mystical and the phenomenological and the aesthetic, then what makes postmodern is kind of rejecting that absolute, place that we have given reason. And as Christians, we know that, our reason has fallen, and it doesn't encompass all of our experience as human beings. It doesn't encompass all of who God is, and his divine nature and his divine intervention in the world that can't be explained by reason. And so all of these things are important. And that's, I think, the stage where our world is going, our thinking is going now, and our social imaginary is shifting along with it.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned modernism. You point out that there are some simultaneous developments, that we may think of evangelicalism as somehow opposed to modernism, but the truth is it's an outgrowth. You make the case, and you're not the only person to make the case, that it's an outgrowth, that it came from modernism. So the Enlightenment, evangelicalism, I don't know that we need to spend a whole lot of time defining evangelicalism, but I'll leave that to you. And maybe a new vision of the imagination are all a kind of given authority to the individual that is, it's not a coincidence that these things came along simultaneously. So can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, and just for the sake of listeners, I do spend quite a bit of time sort of defining evangelicalism as scholars have, because that's kind of a contested and question that people have, and so the sources are in there. But for the purpose of what the way you're directing the conversation now, you've already said it. So evangelicalism really is an emphasis on the individual, individual salvation, individual relationship with Jesus, individual faith. And that is very much an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, and is a reflection of modernity, for good and bad. And that's kind of the point that I'm making. I mean, I do believe in individual conversion, salvation, and relationship with Jesus. But again, even these things take place within a community, within a social imaginary. We're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We are part of a church body. And so even with this emphasis that evangelicalism has had on the individual, which is a direct reflection of modernity, it's limited, just as modernity is.
Yeah. So I think this may be a good place to shift to the idea that a social imaginary or any sort of metaphor elucidates and gives us a new way of seeing and understanding important truths, but more or less by definition then casts other aspects of reality in the shade.
Yes.
Yes. So that again, that's not a self-evident truth. That might require a little explanation. I think it might be helpful to listeners for you to sort of expand on that idea a little bit.
Yeah.
And also talk about where that leaves us. Does that mean we're always stuck with, not knowing, but not having a very partial view of what's real? So
no, let's just go right to the big questions, right? I mean, that is a big question, but so I mean, if we start with the understanding that all language is metaphorical in the sense that all words are, signs for something else, and that's why we have not just usually one definition of a word, but several definitions, and those definitions change over time. So words are metaphorical, and then the metaphors we make from words are even more metaphorical. We're getting very meta here. And so to just recognize that human language is powerful and wonderful, it is limited and changing, and so are metaphors. Whenever we say something is like something else, then we are drawing attention to certain things. Again, going back to attention. So, Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose, newly sprung in June. My love is like a melody, sweetly sung in tune. Beautiful little poem. And it brings out so many ways in which love can be like these things. But obviously it leaves out some things too. Yeah. And so if we walk around with that tune in our heads, as I obviously do, it becomes part of my social imaginary, thinking about what love is like. And to balance it out or fill it out, I need other metaphors as well. And that's why we talk about oftentimes like dead metaphors or cliches, and how they are, we should avoid them, whether in our writing or thinking, because they've been used so much that they lose their power to evoke what they were supposed to, but they also perhaps leave out so much. And so metaphors are powerful until they become overused and dead, and then we need new metaphors, but they also need to be true and reflect reality, which again is the big question.
Yeah. You think about the ways we bring our, even in that example there, if my love is like a red, red rose, if I take that too seriously and then I see God as love, like, okay, now I know what God is like. And we have this tendency, I think, to bring our very limited notions of what reality is. And I know what authority is. I think the Bible is authoritative. Therefore, the Bible must be authoritative in the way that I have in my mind what authority is supposed to look like.
Exactly. And so that word, we can agree that the Bible is authoritative, but then we have to start unpacking. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that look like? How is someone else understanding and applying that in a different way than I do? And that's why we have so many misunderstandings on the internet, right? Because so many people assume that we all mean the same thing when we use a word, rather than having a discussion about what we really mean. And just not to say that language is has no power and can convey no truth, or that there is no truth, but just simply that we are limited creatures using a limited languages differ among people. So, even the word love, to use another example, I mean, it is handled a lot better in the biblical Greek than it is in English, because we only have one word to cover a lot of different kinds of things that we mean when we talk about love.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to expand on the idea of metaphor, as you say, a lot of times we're using metaphors and aren't aware that we're using metaphors. And so if we speak about a person, I'm getting this straight from your book, someone being humans, the way humans function, a high functioning person or a low functioning person, that is a metaphor of machinery. And it's not a disaster to use the word functioning with regard to people, but it's helpful to back up and say that when I'm using this word, I'm talking about those parts of our humanity that are a little bit like a machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a friend of mine who has a daughter with a disability, who I'm quoting in that part, again, as you said, we can use that metaphor because it does illuminate something, but it might not be the best, and it might be dehumanizing. But the most important thing is we have to recognize that it is a metaphor, and that we are saying in this context that a person is like a machine. And so many of our metaphors in this modern age about ourselves as human beings and our relationships are drawn from technology, from science, from machinery, and we don't even realize it. And that's what we need to think about. What underlying assumptions do we have, and do we develop when we use these kinds of metaphors?
Yeah. It's probably, I can't remember which of C.S. Lewis's, but probably the Discarded Image, where he talks about the idea that, we think it's kind of quaint that that the medievals thought they explained gravity by, the apple wants to be on the ground, and that's its true home, and it moves to, whereas fire's true home is up, so it moves up. And that all seems kind of quaint. What we know is that apples are just obeying the law of gravity. And as if obeying a law is less quaint, the idea that an apple can obey a law is less quaint than the idea that an apple, has a desire. It's helpful for us to recognize that this isn't. People used to speak metaphorically, and now we don't. It's that we just have some new metaphors.
Right, it's different metaphors. Right. Obeying a law is a metaphor. Yeah, I love that example.
Yeah, he says as if physical objects were citizens now that could obey.
Right.
Could obey a law.
Obedient, dutiful citizens.
That's right. Yeah. Whereas we can rebel against the law, apples always obey. I'm going to read a couple of lines from your book, if you don't mind. I know a lot of podcast hosts let their guests read their own stuff. Not me. I read their stuff to them.
Oh no, that's delightful.
Yeah. So I think this is. I'd love to hear you expand on this idea because I think it's very relevant to writers. You say to discover similarities, to find connections once unseen, comprises some of the holiest work we can do as human beings, for it is a work of reconciliation. But this truth also entails the obverse. Making wrong connections can be as dangerous as attaching the wrong cable clamp to the wrong battery terminal. Nice use of metaphor there. But there are two really interesting, at least two really interesting ideas there. One is that making connections, which is what we do with the language, is some of the holiest work. It's the work of reconciliation, unless you get it wrong, and then you are doing worse than you're doing real damage. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how great it is that storytellers get to sort of shape people's, shape so many things about people, but then have only recently done a lot of thinking about how dangerous the wrong kind of stories are, how divisive.
Yeah. So that's a mouthful right there. No, exactly. I mean, so to use a very simple example, well, it's not simple, but I think it's, pretty relatable. I said earlier that, the human beings are made in the likeness of God. Christians believe this. And so it's very important to figure out in which ways we are like God
Yeah.
and in which ways we are not him and not like
Yes.
him. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's so much. It's so important to understand how we are, but so much destruction and chaos and evil that can happen when we find likenesses that aren't true. So that would be one simple example. Another is just, I do think that there is, I've never really tried to articulate this, or I'm not sure I even thought it before, so bear with me, but because God models for us in, the personhood and the sacrifice of his only son himself, I do think there's something overwhelmingly conciliatory about him, right? I'm not a universalist, I'm not going there, but there's just something about his nature that is more inclined toward reconciliation and bringing back, as well as separating out, light from dark and good from evil. So it seems like that is more our call as we reflect his likeness, is for us to find the right likenesses. And yet the world we live in today seems so much more characterized by the polarization and the fracturing and the differences, right? We all see the destructiveness of that, I think, right now. And so it just seems like a time when we might just stop and think about how much more we need to find the likenesses with each other, with God, with, love and a red rose, the things around us, the way that we can see God reflected in his creation and in one another. That just feels like the call for us right now. At least it feels like the call for me.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole essence of metaphor is recognizing that the parts of the world rhyme with one another.
Yeah.
And that even I agree with you that some of the holiest work we can do is to say, here's where things rhyme, and here's what we share, and not just here's how I can exert my power using language.
I
make sure I'm
love
getting
that metaphor.
Go ahead.
No, I just love the metaphor of rhyme because harmony. There's so many areas we could look at the way different disciplines bring things together, and rhyme is one way, harmony is another, balance, symmetry. Those are all sort of the traditional classical qualities of beauty, and that points to God.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Karen Swallow Pryor, thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.